please. Before we start daily routine, the subject for late debate for tonight has been chosen, and I will read. Therefore, be it resolved that slashing education budget by $65 million over the past 2 years is having and will continue to have a detrimental effect on students and their education outcomes in this province, and call upon the government to restore education funding. Submitted by the Honourable Member for Yarmouth. Daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition on behalf of the residents of Harborview Crescent in Loosedale, Richmond County. Petition provides a history of their road, and the operative clause says, we, the undersigned residents of Harborview Crescent, request that the asphalt, shoulder and drainage be repaired during the upcoming spring-summer asphalt resurfacing season of 2012. Mr. Speaker, there is 56 signature of residents on the road, and I have affixed my signature.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of my colleague, the Minister of Health and Wellness, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas April 7th marks World Health Day 2012, with this year's campaign focusing on aging and health with the theme of good health adds life to years. And whereas in Nova Scotia we understand the importance of helping our aging population to age well by promoting physical activity and healthy living for people of all ages. And whereas this day is a reminder that we should all begin the conversation about how to better protect our health and well-being. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize April 7th as World Health Day and challenge friends, family, and others in our communities to lead healthy, active lives. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll do this on behalf of the Premier. I hereby give notice on the future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 2012 has been designated the United Nations International Year of Cooperatives and offers the opportunity to celebrate and champion the cooperative movement in Nova Scotia and beyond. And whereas Nova Scotia has a rich and long co-op tradition bolstered by the Nova Scotia Cooperative Council and its 60 years of support and services to individuals and groups who consider the cooperative model for their businesses, and whereas Nova Scotia will continue to promote the cooperative movement and the significant contributions it makes to the economic social growth in communities across this province. Be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly join me in celebrating 2012 as the International Year of the Cooperative and recognize it as a year to celebrate the successes of existing cooperatives and encourage the creation of new ones. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Boston Marathon is the world's oldest annual marathon and ranks as one of the world's most prestigious road racing events. And whereas qualifying for the Boston Marathon is a difficult and competitive task which requires hard work, commitment, and training. Whereas Frank Reinhardt, a dedicated public servant with the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries and Agriculture, has qualified for the 2012 race and will participate in the Boston Marathon on April the 16th, 2012. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly congratulate Frank Reinhardt on qualifying for the Boston Marathon and wish him the best of luck for the race on April the 16th. Mr. Speaker, request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Am I permitted to do an introduction?
Most certainly.
In the East Gallery today, we have some special guests from the Scottish cultural community of Nova Scotia. With us today is Albert Matheson, Chief Lieutenant from the Clan Mathesons of Canada, Daniel Campbell, President of Clan Campbell Society of Nova Scotia, accompanied by his wife Diane, and Mr. William Fisher, Ian McLean, Clan McLean International. If you could stand, please, when I read your name. Cara Moira, Celtic Life Magazine. Karen Henderson, President of Clan Henderson Society of Canada, accompanied by his wife Celeste. Tom Wallace, President of the Federation of Scottish Culture, Nova Scotia, accompanied by his daughter Catherine. And also very special guests, John and Pam Murray. John is the son of the late Bessie Murray, who designed the Nova Scotia tartan, and Margaret and Don Chisholm. If the members could give them a warm welcome.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy today's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia tartan has become a symbol that is instantly recognized around the world as a reflection of the strong influence of Scottish culture on the heritage of our province. And whereas in 1953, the Nova Scotia tartan made its first appearance at the agricultural exhibition in Truro and was adopted as an official symbol of the province in 1955, and in 1956 was approved by Lord Lion King of Arms and registered with Her Majesty's Register Office in Edinburgh, Scotland. And whereas the late Bessie Bally Murray designed the very first Nova Scotia tartan at the request of the Nova Scotia Sheep Breeders Association to demonstrate the many ways for local wool to be used, and as a result created a symbol that will forever be closely tied to our Nova Scotia identity. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge the achievement of Bessie Bally Murray in creating this enduring provincial symbol that continues to remind Nova Scotians of the contribution of the Scottish heritage and culture to our unique way of life. Mr. Speaker, I request notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources would like to congratulate the Canadian Wildlife Federation on its 50th anniversary as Canada's largest conservation organization, and whereas the United Nations General Assembly declared the period 2011-2020 to be the United Nations Decade of Biodiversity, and whereas National Wildlife Week is celebrated April 8th to 14th, 2012, and is an opportunity to reflect on the importance of wildlife and biodiversity to all Nova Scotians. Therefore, it be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly and all Nova Scotians recognize this week of April the 8th to 14th as National Wildlife Week, and congratulate the Canadian Wildlife Federation on its 50th anniversary as Canada's largest conservation organization. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce from the East Gallery this afternoon 6 students from the Nova Scotia Community College Radio Television Arts program. I believe it's specifically offered at the Waterfront campus. And I asked them to stand, and I believe they're with their instructor, Aaron Moore, and I invite my colleagues to give them a warm welcome.
Thank you. We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy today's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader, I forgot to say that. Government notices of motion are over. Introduction of bills. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Review the Public School Programs in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Review the Public School Programs in Nova Scotia.
Bill number 10, entitled An Act to Review the Public School Programs in Nova Scotia.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. We'll now recognize the Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 318 of the Revised Statute 1989, the Nova Scotia Tartan Act.
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 318 of the Revised Statute 1989, the Nova Scotia Tartan Act.
Bill number 11, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 318 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Nova Scotia Tartan Act.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Repeal Chapter 11 of the Acts of 2005, the Petroleum Products Pricing Act.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Repeal Chapter 11 of the Acts of 2005, the Petroleum Products Pricing Act.
Bill number 12, entitled An Act to Repeal Chapter 11 of the Acts of 2005, the Petroleum Products Pricing Act.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas many Nova Scotians can trace their lineage and ancestors to Scotland, and whereas Scottish heritage and culture has contributed to the unique way of life enjoyed by all Nova Scotians, and whereas for 25 years Nova Scotia has celebrated Tartan Day as a way of encouraging and supporting Scottish heritage and culture, therefore be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly support Tartan Day as a way of promoting Scottish culture and support this important part of Nova Scotia's heritage and tradition. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the grade 5-6 class at Rankin School of the Narrows wrote, directed and produced their way into the finals of the Canada-wide Classroom Energy Diet Challenge, and whereas the challenge, sponsored by Shell Canada and Canadian Geographic, is a competition between Canadian classes from kindergarten to grade 12 to produce a public service announcement up to 1 minute long on the importance of youth energy awareness, and whereas the challenge is a creative way for students like the ones at Rankin School to learn the importance of powering down electronics when they are not in use and conserving electricity. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the grade 5-6 class at Rankin School on making it to the finals in the National Energy Diet Challenge and wish them continued success with energy conservation. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Trade Area Transit, a non-profit charitable organization made up of volunteer board of directors, along with many partners and sponsoring organizations with a goal to provide an all-inclusive, accessible and affordable means of transportation to all residents of the Strait area. Whereas Jessica Farrell of Petit de Gras recently accepted the position of General Manager with Strait Area Transit, whereas prior to becoming General Manager, Jessica Farrell held the position of Administration Dispatch with Strait Area Transit. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating Jessica Farrell on becoming the new General Manager of Strait Area Transit and wish her great success in her new position. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day to move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the NDP's 2009 campaign brochure said, and I quote, "Will recruit doctors to cover hard-to-fill shifts so emergency rooms can remain open," end of quote. And whereas despite making this promise, ERs in Middleton, Tattamakgush, Kentville, Glace Bay, New Waterford, North Sydney, and Cape Breton Regional Hospital in Sydney are all looking for ER physicians, with many of the ERs in these hospitals being forced to close due to physician shortages. And whereas in addition to the shortage of ER physicians, Bridgewater is presently looking for 6 family physicians, Caledonia is looking for 4 family doctors, while Chester, Mahone Bay, and Lunenburg all have physician openings. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly urge the Premier and his Minister of Health and Wellness to explain why so many physician vacancies still exist nearly 3 years after they promised Nova Scotians they would recruit more doctors to shorten health care waits. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? No. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. I will now recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on the future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas mental health programs for children and youth in this province is being sacrificed by this NDP government, and whereas supposed investments in reducing wait lists at the IWK is coming at the expense of frontline youth workers who are making a difference in the lives of children and youth in this province by providing valuable program support, and whereas providing faster access to assessments does nothing if there is insufficient programming at both the IWK and in the community to provide treatment post-assessment. Therefore, be it resolved that the Minister of Health and Wellness acknowledge that funding assessments by slashing program support and inpatient beds at the IWK is ill-conceived and premature and does nothing to help those children and youth on a wait list who need program support in order to get well. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? No. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Michelle Leahy from Albert Bridge was recently elected president of the Cape Breton University Student Union, and whereas Michelle is the daughter of Brian and Donna Leahy of Hills Road, and whereas Michelle won the student election with the biggest majority of victory in Cape Breton University Student Union history. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Michelle Leahy on her achievement and wish her all the best of luck in her future career. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Jessica McGrath is a grade 12 student at Prince Andrew High School, and whereas Dalhousie University hosts an annual Brain Bee competition for students in grades 9 to 12, and whereas in this year's 6th annual Brain Bee competition, Ms. McGrath placed second at this prestigious event. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate the Prince Andrew High School senior Jessica McGrath on her outstanding performance in the competition and wish her well in her future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Christy McEachran gave birth to 16 children and was a mother to 19, devoting her life to the love of her family. And whereas Christy was known to enjoy the peace she found milking cows, because that was one of the few opportunities she had to sit down. And whereas this woman of strength lived for over 100 years, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly acknowledge Christy for her contribution to our province and encourage her family to continue their annual June gathering to celebrate the blessing of her faith and her love. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall now move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 41 school librarians in Signecto Central Regional School Board have fallen victim to the NDP's misplaced priorities, and whereas the NDP government has chosen to take aim on their attacks on the front lines of our education system, taking teachers and teachers' aides out of the classroom, and whereas Nova Scotia's teachers are being taken to the brink and are being forced to do more in the classroom but with fewer resources, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly condemn the NDP government's misguided cuts to the core of our education system and urge the Premier and the Minister of Education to take corrective action immediately. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The notice is tabled. I will now recognize the honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Harper Conservative government recently announced significant changes to the old age security program by raising the qualifying age from 65 to 67. And whereas raising the qualifying age will cause significant undue hardship on tens of thousands of Nova Scotians, especially senior women in our province. And whereas those federal Conservative changes target the most vulnerable in our province and will force all Nova Scotia taxpayers to close the gap through additional programs and income supports for low-income seniors. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly condemn the Harper government for those changes and the Premier and the leader of the third party for failing to speak out on behalf of vulnerable Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Order. I couldn't hear if you asked for waiver.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I did ask for waiver.
Couldn't hear. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 100 years ago today, RMS Titanic, a ship that was thought to be unsinkable, left Southampton on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic to New York City. And whereas 4 days later, on April 14th, more than 1,500 passengers and crew were lost when RMS Titanic hit an iceberg and sank. And whereas the majority of victims recovered from the Titanic are buried in 3 Halifax cemeteries, and some of the most significant artifacts and records related to RMS Titanic can be found at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic and in the Nova Scotia Archives. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly remember those lost in RMS Titanic and thank the Nova Scotians who have respectfully preserved the memory of those lost in the tragedy. Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the mission of the Girl Guides of Canada is to enable girls to be confident, resourceful, and courageous, and to make a difference in the world, and whereas by 1917 the Canadian Girl Guide Association was considered to be of such value to the Canadian people that an Act of Parliament was passed approving the Constitution, and whereas guiding still remains true to its ideals of a dynamic organization, changing with the times to reflect the needs and interests of today's girls and women. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of the House of Assembly congratulate Brenda Harvey of Valley, Colchester North, for receiving her 25-year membership pin in Girl Guides of Canada. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas yesterday Canadians marked the 95th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, a formative moment in Canada's history and a battle where many say our young country came of age. And whereas when the Ridge was captured on that cold Easter Monday in 1917, the fight at Vimy Ridge cost 3,500 Canadian lives. And whereas yesterday marked the first major Vimy anniversary without a single living Canadian veteran of the First World War, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House remember the bravery and sacrifice of those who fought at Vimy Ridge and do all we can to keep the memory of the battle and its significance to Canada alive in the minds of future generations. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Colin Colson is a 16-year-old resident of Mineville who attends Cole Harbour High School. Whereas Colin has grown up helping out and serving his community on bottle drives, cleanups, community fairs, and rink maintenance. And whereas Colin has been surfing for the past 5 years all over Nova Scotia and this year has qualified for the Canadian Junior Surf Team and will be competing in Panama in April 2012 in the ISA World Junior Surf Championships. And as well, his brother Craig also qualified, however did not meet the age requirements. Therefore resolved, the members of this House recognize Colin Colson for his dedication to the sport of surfing and help me and congratulate him on being selected to compete in this world competition. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver and of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Cape Breton Centre for Crafts and Design launched 40 weeks of celebrations to recognize their 40th anniversary in February 2012. And whereas since the inception of Cape Breton Centre for Crafts and Design, professional artisans and craft producers have embraced the opportunity to network to build an ever-growing economy by passing on their skills and knowledge to one another. And whereas dedicated staff and volunteers strive to make Cape Breton handcrafted work as well-known and must-have products. Therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Executive Director Carol Beaton, her staff and many volunteers on 40 years of accomplishments at the Cape Breton Centre for Crafts and Design and wish them every future success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 38th Annual Provincial Volunteer Award Ceremony and Luncheon was held on April 2nd in Halifax, and whereas this ceremony honoured volunteers for the important contributions they have made to their communities and to the province, and whereas David Salos from the town of Yarmouth, who volunteers for organizations and committees such as the Yarmouth County Historical Society, the Yarmouth County Community Health Board, and Communities in Bloom, to name a few, was among the 70 volunteer representatives being honoured. Therefore, be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate David Salos of Yarmouth on receiving this prestigious honour and thank him for dedicating so much of his time, effort, and energy into our community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Argyll.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice of future date. I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Simon D'Entremont, a Lower West Pubnico native, has been appointed as Deputy Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. And whereas Mr. D'Entremont has more than 15 years' experience working for the federal government, and whereas Mr. D'Entremont replaces Sandra McKenzie, who was appointed Deputy Minister of Labour and Workforce Development, Labour and Advanced Education, and began his position January 23rd, 2012. And therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Simon D'Entremont on his new posting and wish him continued success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the pre-entry to employment program is a transition to employment program through the YMCA, which has a strong emphasis on life skills and an employment component by having each participant work 1 day per week in a field of their interests. Whereas the pre-entry to employment program enables these individuals to experience new opportunities while at the same time becoming better prepared for the workplace and gaining valuable life experiences. Whereas on March 19, 2012, I attended a ceremony held at the Shannon Studio in the Port Hawkesbury Civic Centre to celebrate Tanya Monroe, Keith O'Brien, Arnold Kite, Karina McMillan, Shannon Bona, Kendra McDonnell, Paul Grenier, Juanita McPhee, Lee Canham, Santana LeBlanc, Jared McNamara, and Jeffrey Lawrence's graduation from the pre-entry to employment program. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating each participant of the pre-entry to employment program through the YMCA for their hard work and dedication, and wish them success in their future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas, despite being 8 months late, the Minister of Natural Resources finally released what was described as a non-technical definition of clear-cutting in August, and whereas Nova Scotians involved in this province's billion-dollar forest industry are still anxiously awaiting a clear-cut definition, not just a 26-word non-technical one, and whereas a Truro company announced in February that it was closing down because the current government failed to provide clear-cut regulations. Therefore, be resolved that the Minister of Natural Resources understand the importance of truly defining the term clear-cut and stop his government's constant delaying before he forces other companies out of work. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. Now recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Amelia Snow, a grade 5 student at Ecole Rose Devant in Greenwood, was the recipient of the 2011 Kayak Kids Illustrated History Challenge French Award, and whereas Amelia traveled to Radu Hall in Ottawa with a Right Honourable David Johnston presented her award as the Governor General's History Award ceremony held this past December, and whereas this award provides a natural opportunity to encourage promising young students like Amelia to pursue their passion and interest in Canadian history, therefore be it resolved that the House of Assembly recognize and congratulate Amelia Snow for winning the 2011 Kayak Kids Illustrated History Challenge French Award, and wish her every success in future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Darian Bernard, a Wekukmak teenager, has taken a leadership role by bringing an anti-bullying campaign to the Wekukmak First Nation School. And whereas Darian believes children need to know the serious effects of bullying, the different types of bullying, and that all are unacceptable. And whereas Darian drew inspiration for the campaign while working on the topic for a school documentary film. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly acknowledge Darian Bernard for standing up for what is right and for being a role model for her peers. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Alice Housing has provided safe, affordable housing and counselling for women and children escaping domestic abuse since 1983, and whereas on October 20th, 2011, Alice Housing launched Healing the Bruises Through the Eyes of a Child, a graphic novel written by Laurie Morgan, chronicling a child's journey from violence to safety, and whereas Ms. Morgan, a child and youth counsellor for Alice Housing, has been awarded the Minister's Award for Crime Prevention at the Nova Scotia Crime Symposium held on March 28, 2012, Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly recognize Laurie Morgan on her dedication to this project and the families of Alice Housing and congratulate her on this award. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Lenten ecumenical lunches at St. John's Anglican Church in North Sydney provide fellowship for those who attend and raise awareness and money for the Primates World Relief Development Fund, which is the Canadian Anglican response for emergency relief, refugees, development and justice. And whereas the Primates World Relief Development Fund was established by the Anglican Church following the Spring Hill mine explosion in 1958. And whereas before the lunches, there are church services, sing-songs, guest speakers, and discussion groups. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the many volunteers who make weekly Lenten ecumenical lunches a reality during the Lenten period. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bedford residents Emma Travers, Isabel Sardi, and Julia Sardi, as a competitive team, took first place at an Acadia University robot programming competition for middle school students. And whereas the girls team called EIJ Robotics created a pre-programmed robot made primarily of Lego parts, which was judged on design, research, core values, and performance in an obstacle course. And whereas EIJ Robotics win at the Acadia competition entitles the team to go on to compete in the North American Championship in California in May. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Emma Travers, Isabel Sardi, and Julia Sardi on their first place win and on their participation, which has in itself motivated other girls to join the robotics competition. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 38th Annual Provincial Volunteer Awards Ceremony and Luncheon was held on April 2nd in Halifax. And whereas this ceremony honors volunteers for the important contributions they have made to their communities and to the province. And whereas Oral Mooney from the municipality of Yarmouth, who dedicates her time to the Yarmouth County Historical Society, IODE, and athletics and arts in her community, was among the 70 volunteer representatives being honored. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Oral Mooney of the municipality of Yarmouth on receiving this prestigious honor and thank her for dedicating so much of her time, effort, and energy to our community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 2:44. We will finish at 3:44. I will now recognize the honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on April 21st, 2011, 1 year ago, when asked about funding cuts, the Minister of Education stood in this House and said, and I quote, "I trust that the impact will not be felt by students in the classroom," end of quote. Mr. Speaker, a year has passed, and boards have seen another round of this government's short-sighted budget cuts. Students, parents, and teachers are feeling the impact, and it's not positive. They are concerned again about the future impacts this will have on public education. The evidence can be found in every board across this province, Mr. Speaker, if the minister wanted to look. So my question to the minister is this: how can the minister defend the statement she made in the House on April 2011, knowing that her government's cuts are having a negative impact in the classroom?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are making sure that the funding is appropriate for the students in this province. The ratio is 12.9 to 1. We've increased funding per student. We are meeting the needs of our students in the province of Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. School boards are starting now to approve their budgets and to announce the negative effect that this government's cuts are having on education. In particular, Chignecto Central Regional School Board has announced that it will lay off all librarians and library technicians in every school in that board. Libraries are the hub of learning and the research in schools. They are essential in fostering independent learning, in literacy, and in preparation for post-secondary education. Boards are forced to eliminate library services in order to respond to this government's short-sighted budget reductions. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is this. Will the minister stand on her feet in this House today and tell the students in Chignecto Central Regional School Board that she will restore funding to the board to ensure that their libraries are protected?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, it was an extremely disappointing to hear what Chignecto has decided to do, and as I understand, there's been no final decisions. The HOG formula very clearly does allocate appropriate funding to their board for library services. This government stands behind supporting our libraries, and we do that through our formula. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Disappointment is putting it mildly when you talk to parents and teachers and students in Chignecto Central and other boards around the province. Mr. Speaker, the students at Cobequid Education Centre, one of the largest schools, high schools in the province, are concerned about the library in their school. They know the value of their library, their librarians, and the opportunities that library provides. They know that these decisions were forced on the board by the NDP government. Mr. Speaker, those students get it. Once again, they're questioning the minister's decision. She failed to stand up for students during last year's budget decisions. She's failed again to stand up for students during this year's budget decisions. Mr. Speaker, those students are planning to walk out tomorrow in protest of losing this valuable resource. So my question to the minister is this. She has time, if she's interested in supporting students, to stand up now for the students of Cobequid Education Centre and other high schools in Chignecto Central and give the money that they need to keep their library open.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to repeat that we are making sure that we're funding school boards appropriately, and through the HOG formula, there is a line there for support of the libraries. They have $3.8 million in their budget line in Chignecto for their libraries. This is a decision that the school board is making, and I would like to have an explanation from the school board on how they are going to ensure that the students of Chignecto have library services next year. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just before the holiday weekend, 41 librarians of the Chignecto Central Regional School Board found out they would be out of a job, every single one of them. My question is for the Premier. This is proof that the cuts imposed by the Premier's government are in fact being felt at the frontline level of service, a service valued by all Nova Scotians and certainly by those students and parents in the Chignecto Central region. It is a sacrifice, Mr. Speaker, that is sadly not felt by the Premier's own Minister of Finance, who finished last year with a forecast 216 employees in his own department, but in his budget is going to fund 257 full-time employees in the coming year, an increase of, guess what, the same number of 41. And so my question to the Premier is, why is 41 new funded positions in finance more important than 41 librarians at Chignecto Central Regional School Board?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, let me be really clear. Any board that says that it's going to cut the entire library service from their budget cannot be taken seriously. And I think it's an abrogation. It's an abrogation of their responsibility to the children in their charge. And I want to be, like I said, very, very clear that this is nothing but a political game being played by the school board. They are funded for those positions, and if they don't use the money for that funding, then maybe they just don't want the funding.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, any premier that stands by and watches 41 librarians fired while 41 more bureaucrats are going to be added at finance does not deserve to be taken seriously either, Mr. Speaker. And it doesn't stop at finance. The Department of Education finished the most recent year with 177 full-time people in the forecast for the year just ended, but has a budget for 194 in the upcoming year, an increase of 17. So I'll ask the Premier again if he wants to be taken seriously. Why is 17 more bureaucrats at the Department of Education okay, while firing 41 librarians at Chignecto Central School Board has to happen? Which is his real priority? More in Halifax and less in Chignecto, or the other way around?
Honourable the Premier.
Unfortunately, the Leader of the Conservative Party wrote that question before he heard my first answer, because the simple fact of the matter is they know that the school board knows that to the families and children that they are supposed to serve, that those cuts would be unacceptable. They are unacceptable to them, they are unacceptable to the community, and they are unacceptable to us, Mr. Speaker. Be assured.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what is unacceptable to the people of Chignecto Central Regional School Board, the parents and the students, in fact all Nova Scotians, is that they have a government that is adding 553 new full-time equivalent positions at the centre of government while watching 41 librarians, and multiply that across the province, being cut at the school board level. If he truly wants his own answers to be taken seriously, will he explain to all those parents and all those students why those cuts have to happen while he adds more bureaucrats at the department level, like finance, like education, in Halifax?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, not only has the Chignecto School Board been playing games, but obviously he wants to participate in this as well. He knows that there are hundreds less employees on the rolls of the provincial government now than there was. He knows that in fact we have all shared in the restraint that's necessary in order to get the province back to balance and to deal with the hundreds of millions of dollars, no, billions of dollars of deficit left behind by the Conservative government.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this NDP government has attacked our public education system by slashing more than $60 million from the budget. Mr. Speaker, in 2003, the Premier said, and I quote, "This is the NDP's key commitment to ensure that every student receives the individual attention they need in the classroom," end of quote. We now have fewer teachers, fewer teacher assistants, larger class sizes, Mr. Speaker, and this government has made it impossible to ensure that every student receives the attention he or she may need. So my question to the Premier, how can you reconcile these statements in the past with your current action that are costing students essential services and additional support?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, contrary to what the Leader of the Official Opposition says, the per capita funding for students is going to be at its highest level in our history, and the student-teacher ratio is going to be at its lowest.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, and the bureaucracy in the Department of Education is going to be at an all-time high as well, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members of the Premier's party have also extensively warned about education cuts. Mr. Speaker, on May 9, 2000, the now Minister of Transportation tabled a petition that he personally signed on behalf of the residents of Inverness. The petition declared, and I quote, "We, the undersigned, protest a reduction in the public education budget recently announced by the Minister of Finance. These cuts will have a devastating impact on our province and our students," end of quote. This government has made more than $60 million, Mr. Speaker, cuts in public education over the last 2 years. My question to the Premier, how can the NDP government defend more than $60 million in education cuts today when they were so opposed to them in 2000?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I pointed out, and as pointed out numerous times, there are 300 more teachers in the system today than there was 10 years ago when there were 10,000 more students. Mr. Speaker, we have the highest individual per student rate of funding in our history. We have the lowest student-teacher ratio in decades, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this government argues that they are merely basing education funding on enrollment and the number of students. But, Mr. Speaker, on March 6, 2002, the now Deputy Premier wrote an op-ed in response to Jane Purvis's comments that dollars must follow the students. Mr. Speaker wrote, and I quote, "In a time of economic transition, our survival will depend on vision, knowledge, and skill. It will require an education system that will equip the next generation with these tools, not a crude per capita based funding formula that will lead us to educational discrimination." End of quote. So my question to the Premier, why is his government pursuing a funding approach that the Deputy Premier called crude and discriminatory?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to apologize to the Leader of the Opposition because I made a mistake in the answer to the last question. I said we had 10,000 less students than we had a decade ago. We have 30,000 less students than we had a decade ago. 300 more teachers, highest per capita funding in our history, and among the lowest student-teacher ratio in decades.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on a new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's clear that public education is not a priority for this government. We have fewer teachers, fewer teacher assistants, Mr. Speaker, growing class sizes. During the March 26, 2008 presentation to the Halifax Regional School Board, the now Health Minister said, and I quote, "When I imagine the schools and the community I am so lucky to live in, I don't imagine fewer teachers, larger class sizes, and bigger caseloads or longer wait times for specialized staff." End of quote. We now have fewer teachers, larger class sizes, bigger caseloads, and longer wait times for specialized staff. So my question to the Premier, if the NDP couldn't imagine such an education system in 2008, why is his government creating this kind of system today?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, we're not, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we're making investments in education that are going to improve the opportunities for our students. That's why we have a new skilled trades high school going into Cole Harbour. It's why we've put money into ensuring that exactly the services that the Minister of Health talked about are available for students. It is why we are ensuring that the per capita funding for students continues to rise. It is why we are continuing to ensure that the number of teachers, number of students per teacher continues to go down.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, to the point, why did you raise the cap size, Mr. Speaker? It not only, Mr. Speaker, are the diversity of the classroom much different than it was in 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, when all of these statements were made, Mr. Speaker. He is adding new programs at the same time he is cutting funding, Mr. Speaker. This government, the Premier, is quick to not accept responsibility for his actions, but blame school boards, Mr. Speaker. And I want to quote the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage in 2005, Mr. Speaker. And the quote is, "They, the school board, are not holding us hostage. The province is," end of quote. So my question for the Premier, in 2005, the NDP said the school board should not take the blame for impacts on the province's education cuts. What has changed?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, last year we saw the Central Chignecto School Board come forward with all kinds of, dire predictions about what were going to happen and how many school teachers were going to be lost. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? Didn't happen. Of course it didn't happen. And it didn't happen because this is simply a game being played by that school board. And I say by that school board. And we're going to make sure that the kids who rely on the services, whether they are librarians or other services, services or that adult learners who need adult education in that board are going to get the services they need.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, are those communities that are opposing school closures playing a game? The decision made by this government, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, are the parents across this province who are having to suffer the devastating educational cuts playing a game, Mr. Speaker? Let's be clear. There's only one government, there's only one place where a check is written in this province for public education, and is squarely at the feet of the Premier of this province, Mr. Speaker. It is the Premier of this province who is taking $60 million out of public education and asking school boards to deliver more with less, Mr. Speaker. That's the game we're playing in this place, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2001, in a Chronicle Herald op-ed about government cuts, the now Finance Minister said, and I quote, "Are they going to cut services to the sick, the young, and the poor?" End of quote. This government, Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times, has cut $60 million out of public education in the last year. So my question to the Premier, the same question posed by the Finance Minister in 2001 op-ed. Why, especially in these anxious times, is your government so keen to cut?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I pointed out, the amount of money that's going into education is increasing, not decreasing. Every student in the public education system will be funded at a higher rate this year than they have in past years, Mr. Speaker. We are providing the services, ensuring that the boards, who are supposed to be our partners in the delivery of these services, get the funding that they need in order to provide the services that people need.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Under questioning last week about the protection of kids at a daycare from an alleged abuser, the minister continuously referred to some protocol that she followed for this situation. Well, we've been asking for that protocol ever since, Mr. Speaker, and I can just share with you that we were provided with an awful lot of material just a few minutes before question period today, but nowhere in that material is anything resembling a protocol for the situation that the minister was asked about last week. And so my question to the minister is this: is there a real protocol that covers the situation that we asked about, or just an imaginary one?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, as I stated last week, this is a very serious and sensitive issue, and that we take the safety of our children very serious in the Department of Community Services and within this government. And the fact is that we have said over and over we took immediate action. There is a protocol. We gave the member opposite that information, and it shows what that protocol is. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that the government knew about this situation where there's an alleged abuser employed by a daycare months and months and months ago. What is unique about this situation is the government knew because it is an active participant in litigation where the alleged abuser is named in the litigation, Mr. Speaker, and the government knew that this alleged abuser is employed at a daycare. There is no protocol that says that the minister could not do the right thing and pick up the phone when she became aware and inform the daycare of the risk that they were running. And so my question is, where is it in this so-called protocol that says you can't do the right thing and call the daycare?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, as I have said before in this House, that we took immediate action. We were informed and received information on November the 15th, 2010. The very same day, we took action to contact the authorities. We contacted the Halifax Regional Police and the RCMP Integrated Major Crimes Unit. We also did an internal investigation. We checked the child abuse registry. We took every immediate action that protocol states. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it appears the minister did everything but pick up the phone and call the daycare itself, where the risk was being run. The RCMP will conduct a criminal investigation. The Department of Community Services has their own investigative powers, but common sense tells us that someone would pick up the telephone and call the daycare and let them know the risk that they were running. The fact of the matter is there is no protocol that says you can't do that. But it appears the minister did everything but call that daycare. So my question is, will she just admit, yes or no? Did she call the daycare to tell them the risk that they were running, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I believe that the member opposite and his party should reflect on the fact that this is a serious, sensitive, and emotional situation that affects people's lives. They should not be taking this information and facts and trying to create misperceptions in the public that the daycare did not know. And I would like to table, Mr. Speaker, I would like to table 3 articles that clearly states that the daycare was informed of these alleged allegations over 10 years ago. That party knows that, and that party is sickening to try to turn this into a political game.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, in 2002, the Deputy Premier was very concerned about education funding by the previous Tory government and the impact it would have on students in Cape Breton. In a March 6, 2002 op-ed to the Cape Breton Post, the Deputy Premier wrote, and I quote, "If there's any will at all to build a new economy for Cape Breton, it must include a commitment to education," end quote. Mr. Speaker, since this government took office, Cape Breton Regional School Board saw several schools close, including Holy Angels High, Ashby Elementary, and Cornwallis Elementary. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Education tell members of this House how the Deputy Premier upheld his, quote, "commitment to education," end quote, while your government made the decision to slash public education funding and force the Cape Breton Regional School Board to close these schools?
Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. I would like to say that I stand behind my Deputy Premier and with this government that we are making sure that our funds match the needs of our students in the province today.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in the same Cape Breton Post op-ed from 2002, the Deputy Premier noted his concerns with the funding formula that was used. And I quote, "In a time of economic transition, our survival will depend on vision, knowledge, and skill. It will require an educational system that will equip the next generation with these tools, not a crude, per capita based funding formula that will lead us to educational discrimination," end quote. In 2002, the Deputy Premier called the hand government's per-student funding formula, the very same formula they are using today, crude and discriminatory. So my question to Minister of Education is, did the Deputy Premier ever inform the Minister of Education that the way your government funds school boards is crude and discriminatory?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's 2 aspects of his question. I first would like to just clarify that this government changed the funding formula along with, there were 24 meetings that we had with the school boards in this province to make sure that the funding that we're providing to the school boards is allocated appropriately. So the funding formula has been changed, and we're making sure that we're strategically investing in the needs of our students in this province. And I would also like to say that we are making sure that the students in this province that are interested in skilled trades are getting it. We're doubling our capacity. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this is but one more example of what the NDP said in opposition is completely opposite of what they say while they're in government. Mr. Speaker, due to the funding cuts made by the NDP government, both the Cape Breton Regional School Board and the Strait Regional School Board have been forced to announce school closures, which has caused great distress amongst teachers and amongst the communities. The Strait Regional School Board itself has voted to close 3 schools because of the funding changes made by this government. So my question to the Premier, would he advise us as to whether he believes that the Strait Regional School Board was simply playing games when they voted to close 3 schools in our board?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the boards, all of the boards, are given money in order to be able to provide the services that they dictate are needed by their students. So when they make decisions on schools that are outdated or have very, very low enrollments, that's a decision that is made by the school board quite appropriately.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, the evidence speaks for itself. When it comes to justice in this province, the NDP are putting lives at risk. Even the Minister of Justice admitted in a September 2010 news release that the escalating inmate violence at the Burnside facility is not acceptable and will not be tolerated. The minister talks a big game but has not followed through. Just days ago, a 21-year-old Burnside jail inmate was sent to the hospital with serious head injuries following an alleged assault with a weapon. Sadly, this is not an isolated incident. Violent offences in correctional facilities appear to be happening on a regular basis under this minister's watch. My question for the Minister of Justice, when will the minister admit that he has failed to keep staff and inmates safe in our province's correctional facilities and take real action so no more Nova Scotian lives will be put at risk?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that question. I want to assure everyone in Nova Scotia that I take violence in any form, whether it's in an institution or in our community as a whole, and our record stands very sound on taking positive steps to change behaviour. I will outline to the member, though, that our clients that are housed in those institutions are there because they have failed to follow the rules and regulations within society, and the level of violence amongst that segment of our society is higher than the general population of society. So will incidents happen in there? Certainly. But the professionalism of our staff there is second to none, and they maintain a highly qualified institution. Incidents will occur. We're saddened that this incident has occurred, and there will be incidents in the future, and we're taking all the steps to ensure the safety of each and every person.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, when in opposition, the NDP seem to have all of the answers when it comes to the management of our correctional facilities. In fact, back in 2008, Premier Dexter told reporters that problems at the Burnside facility could be boiled down to just simply a staffing shortage. So, Mr. Speaker, interestingly enough, at the same time, guards were pushing to secure a new labour agreement. In the fall of 2010, the minister announced 30 more part-time staff would be hired at the Burnside facility, but the violence, as we've seen, has continued. The minister followed the Premier's advice and hired more staff, but that failed to stem the violence. So which is it? Was the Premier wrong, or is the minister going to give us another excuse for his government's mismanagement at Burnside?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's no secret that I spent a lifetime on the front lines of policing and dealing with the criminal element in this province. And I want to assure you that violence occurs on a daily basis, and I respect and I admire the officers that are out there to do that job, as well as the correctional officer that has a very trying job to do. I find them very professional. They do the utmost to ensure the integrity of the facility, to maintain safety. I want to point out to the member that this government is sensitive to those issues, take them seriously, and we have the proper resources in place, and we're in the process of building a new facility and changing some of the steps that were taken there. I do recognize, though, that coming from the third party, that where there was virtually limited policy, limited direction, and accountability, this government is accountable and taking action.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, the evidence speaks for itself. This minister has failed to keep Nova Scotians in our correctional facilities safe. in another, and I don't find anything funny about this, Mr. Speaker. In fact, people who are incarcerated, while they may have committed wrong, they're entitled to reform themselves. They should be able to do that in a safe way, without feeling risk for their life. So this minister has failed to keep Nova Scotians in our correctional facility safe. And in another unfortunate example, in May, a Burnside inmate was thrown down a flight of stairs during a fight with another prisoner, and he ended up on life support. Mr. Speaker, this inmate, regardless of his crimes, has family and friends who love him. My question to the minister: what does the minister have to say to the friends and families of inmates who have been seriously injured or lost their lives under his watch?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think the evidence shows that the institution. I think the evidence shows that there's been progressive steps made to improve the quality of service in there, the accountability, and what goes on there. What the member is failing to understand is the culture within those institutions or the life of certain segments of society. And yes, it's saddened when anyone gets injured in our facilities, and I am compassionate to the families and the people that are affected by that. However, we are dealing with a very difficult segment of our society, and they're in there for a reason, and they're in there to be protected, and the public needs to be protected.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education recently handed out orange lunch bags to primary students in 4 school boards: in Annapolis Valley, Cape Breton Victoria School Board, Strait Regional School Board, and South Shore School Board. Mr. Speaker, these bags cost over $35 each for a grand total of $124,030.51. Speaker, parents of students with special needs are worried about their children losing education assistance due to NDP funding cuts. All the while, the Minister of Education is handing out orange lunch bags. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Education tell members of this House today how many education assistants a board could hire for around $124,000?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much for the question. The lunch bags, which is actually almost a derogatory term to what we provided for our students. What we have provided is a bag full of things for our families of our youngest students coming to school. So when a child is coming to school in primary, they're going to receive a bag filled with tapes and books and information on parents, and crayons and scissors and construction paper, and I could go on. What we're finding is that children are coming to school not having the experience of sometimes that back and forth language development that they're having in their communities and with parents, because unfortunately many of our students' children are spending too much screen time. So this was part of the Succeeding in Reading. That budget line was with the Succeeding in Reading budget line that we provided, and it took a while for us to compile that. We did it within the department, and they are in a bag that goes home to the student, which they can reuse for whatever they choose to reuse it for. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Well, it's quite ironic, Mr. Speaker, that we now have a government that's trying to tell parents how to raise their children and how to properly educate their children before they get to school. But, even better than that, Mr. Speaker, is what the Minister of Education failed to say is that the little trinkets she included in her orange bag were made in China. Just what Nova Scotia parents need is things made in China to give their children to play with before they go to school. Mr. Speaker, parents are looking for answers as to why this government feels that extra support for students is being cut by this government. So my question to the Minister, as an educator herself, will she tell members of this House how getting lunch bags full of trinkets will offset the damage done by increasing class sizes for Nova Scotia's youngest students.
Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's very important that we are making sure that our children are successful. We need to make sure that children coming into school get the supports that they need so that they can be successful as they move through our system. We recognize that our literacy levels needed to have some improvement, and the department worked very carefully with all of the school boards in this province to see where we could make sure children can be successful. So this is a part of succeeding in reading, to put literacy in the hands of our youngest children when they come to school. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and maybe the minister will be kind enough to table in this House correspondence from the school boards that actually asked for the orange lunch bag to be sent to children coming into their boards. Mr. Speaker, school boards are laughing at the orange lunch bags, in case the minister is not aware. Mr. Speaker, thanks to this government, boards are being forced to close schools to reach budget targets. Communities feel that the review process is biased to close schools because boards simply cannot afford to keep them open. 2 reviews in the Strait Regional School Board are under judicial review. Parents and communities are worried about losing schools and having young children spending additional time on school buses. Mr. Speaker, the minister slashed education funding, boards are being forced to close schools, teachers are being laid off, class sizes are growing, school supports are being lost, and the minister is handing out orange lunch bags. So my question is, will the Minister of Education stand up to the Premier and Minister of Finance and demand that cuts to public education stop?
Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. Our student funding is increasing. We have the lowest class sizes in the history of this province. We are strategically investing. Our Kids and Learning First plan makes sure that we are providing the services that our children need to be successful. We are making sure that we have skills trades available in our school, that we have the ability for students to get a credit outside of the school system in an area that they're interested in. Kids and Learning First is a plan for every child in this province to succeed. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Mr. Speaker, last week in allnovascotia.com, we learned that the Labour Department has 7 union certification applications. It's only a matter of time, Mr. Speaker. Propeller Brewing Company is just one of those 7 that's facing unionization, most likely as a result of this government's risky new labour law. Mr. Speaker, Propeller is one of those local Nova Scotia success stories. For the last 6 or 7 years, Mr. Speaker, Propeller has been growing by between 15% and 20% a year. But because of the NDP, Mr. Speaker, Propeller could have a third party force unpredictable labour costs upon it and harm its ability to grow and compete successfully with the Nova Scotia product. So my question through you to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister admit that the government should be helping business propel themselves forward instead of giving them the shaft?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to remind the members of this chamber that the right to unionize and to begin collective bargaining is guaranteed under federal legislation. And certainly, we recognize that having a stable labor relations climate in this province is very critical to building productivity and also building the prosperity of our province. There have been 7 applications to the Labour Board for certification. Some of those began before the first contract legislation was implemented, which was, I think, January the 21st. None of those to date have been granted. As I said, they're still in process. And it's my understanding that there have been no applications to the Labour Board or to the department for any of the first contract
privileges or benefits. So that no one has asked for that yet. It's not it's not been actioned, and certainly when information is available on that, we'll be able to provide it to the House. But there has been no flurry of applications. This is the ordinary number of applications to the Labour Board for certification. It's part of the normal business in this province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria Lakes on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the right to unionize has been there for 100 years. All this government has done with its first contract arbitration is just make it a lot easier, that's all. Mr. Speaker, small business owners in Nova Scotia are barely able to keep their head afloat. They make incredible sacrifices and bear extreme financial risk just to live out their passion and employ a few deserving people. Mr. Speaker, Propeller's owner, when asked by allnovascotia.com about whether or not he's a wealthy man, said, and I quote, "I drive a 2001 Suzuki Esteem. We call it the low self-esteem." Mr. Speaker, I bet you the Premier's right-hand Labour friend, Rick Clark, has pretty high self-esteem these days. Oh, yeah. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister is, who does she side with? An employer trying to provide meaningful jobs to local families, or her government's special interest Labour friends?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to say that this government respects the laws of the country and respects due process, and that's what we're enforcing. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria Lakes on his final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, it's a good thing Propeller's not bidding for contracts from shipbuilding. They'd be facing uncertain costs at the worst possible time because they would have an expensive contract forced on them by NDP job-killing legislation. So that we don't run the risk of blowing the opportunity from the shipbuilding contract, Mr. Speaker, the NDP should be helping Nova Scotia businesses compete against other places. So my final supplementary to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, is when will she commit to rip up her job-killing legislation and give Nova Scotia businesses a fighting chance to compete?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have said on the floor of this chamber many, many times, first contract legislation is actually to provide more stability, especially when an employer is faced for the first time with a unionized workplace. And it gives every possible support to both the union and to the employer to negotiate according to our collective bargaining process here in the province. And if it runs into any difficulties, then we have additional supports that we can bring into place. This is helping business in this province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's 2012-13 budget target parameters stated that the review of the school board funding formula, known as the HOG formula, had been approved and would be implemented with this budget. So my question to the Minister of Education is this: do the changes in the funding formula take into account declining enrollment?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
I'm going to be up for estimates, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that a number of those questions can be asked of me at that time. But the formula, the HOG formula, is based, it's a tool to allocate the money. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Well,
on her first supplementary.
I would take that the minister doesn't know, but perhaps she will be by the time estimates somebody will tell her. So, Mr. Speaker, prior to changes in the formula, as the minister should know, declining enrollments were addressed and funding responded to enrollment figures from each board. So my question to the minister: how are those declining enrollments now accommodated in the new formula?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have had 24 meetings with school boards. All the school boards in the province were consulted. The funding formula is a tool that is used to make sure that the funds are allocated appropriately to our school boards. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Well, I guess it would be 3 strikes, you're out. No answer to the first one, no answer to the second one, so we'll try the third one. Mr. Speaker, this is obviously not working, and the minister is forcing boards to further cut teaching positions because the formula apparently does not address declining enrollment. With the implementation of the formula, for example, Chignecto Central is supposed to be reduced by 18 FTEs. In order to balance the books, they had to be reduced by 51.6 teaching FTEs. The South Shore Board funding formula would translate into a loss of 5 teachers. But again, in order to balance the books, they have had to add another 15 reductions for a total of 20. So my question to the minister, why has the minister accepted and started to use a funding formula model that obviously does not adequately address declining enrollment?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
I guess, Mr. Speaker, I will try to answer this by saying that the budget actually is based on our enrollment in the students in the province of Nova Scotia. We know that we are in a declining enrollment for next year, 1.7, and we made sure that our target is 1.3 to accommodate the fixed costs that school board has. The budget target is actually the part of addressing the declining enrollment. The tool to allocate the money is the formula. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, NASCAD is a world-renowned institution and the only fine arts institution that we have here in the province. However, its future is in question. As a result of the Windsor report that's come out, NASCAD has been asked to put forward a business plan to this province, yet we haven't heard a response from this government as a result of that business plan. My question to the Minister of Advanced Education is, when can the folks at NASCAD expect a response, and what is this government's intention when it comes to the future of NASCAD in the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I received the report at the end of March. My officials are analyzing the information in it, and I expect to be able to respond to NASCAD within a matter of weeks. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the answer to the question. However, there was another report that was done earlier, it was titled the Hog Formula. This report was actually buried by the government, and its information wasn't released until someone did a Freedom of Information request on it. In this report, they highlighted the fact that it's actually the funding formula to our post-secondary institutions that put NASCAD at a financial disadvantage. My question to the minister is, why was that report buried in the government? Buried with this government and not acted upon?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Hogg was invited to analyze the financial situation of NASCAD, and he reported back in 2010. It was sort of a snapshot in time of their financial situation. The Hogg report was one of a number of reports that government used to realize the severity of the financial challenges facing that institution. And because of our commitment to fine arts programming in this province, we took all the information from the reports very, very seriously, and we wanted to work with NASCAD to make sure that it was sustainable into the future. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is that first report wasn't taken seriously. The report that highlighted the fact that the way NASCAD is funded through the province puts it at a financial disadvantage. However, the next report, which put all the blame on NASCAD's administration, was acted upon. So my question to the minister, is there an agenda here to close NASCAD University and an agenda against our arts community?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the contrary, this government has invested $6 million extra to NASCAD for funding over the last 3 years because we value the excellence of programming in that institution, and we are giving them time to work out a sustainability plan so that they continue well into the future. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after an 8-month delay, this government released their watered-down, inadequate natural resources strategy. A FOIPOP obtained by a media outlet showed that the minister acted like a dentist, and he removed the teeth from this strategy. He deleted the chapter that required external reviews of the program. He deleted the section clarifying which departments are responsible for which resources. And he deleted the section requiring management plans for woodlands used in energy production. Mr. Speaker, my question for the minister is this. If the minister was serious about producing a strategy to transform the way Nova Scotia's natural resources are managed, why did he reduce it to just a puff piece?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not quite clear what the honourable member is asking, but it's right. We released our natural resources strategy on August 16th of last summer, and we've been working very hard within the department to meet a number of goals. And you know, one of them in the forestry sector is reduce our clear cutting to 50% within 5 years. We're well on our way to that target. We're working with industry and non-governmental organizations and woodlot owners and Nova Scotians in general. We're working hard on our biomass practice within the Code of Forest Practice. We're working on mineral resources and parks review and biodiversity, a number of good initiatives that are all underway at this point in time.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, by removing these sections, actually the minister did a clear cutting of his own strategy. This minister has produced an all sizzle and no stake document that does little to provide answers to Nova Scotians. He is failing in his obligation to provide real leadership to a sector that is vital to our province's future. My question to the minister is this. Will the minister admit that his do-nothing strategy and that his natural resources plan for 2012 is to say precious little about what this province needs to do?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder who writes these questions for the honourable member, but we've been working on a number of positive initiatives in forestry, in biodiversity, in parks, and in geological resources. For example, in forestry, we've had a number of good initiatives on the ground in eastern Nova Scotia, as the member may be aware, in Guysborough and Pictou and Antigonish counties, as well as in Cape Breton, working directly with the forest contractors, working directly with the harvesters to find new ways of doing forestry in this province, based around getting away from clear cutting and looking a lot more at Category 7 types of initiatives, more silviculture, more long-term investment in the future of our forestry. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of good initiatives. I'd be willing to sit down with the member and detail all of those if the member has time.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have been waiting for more than 15 months for a technical definition of clear cutting. The NDP clearly has something to hide with this strategy. They took all the teeth out of it, and businesses are suffering as a result. Hodgins Chipping of Truro has been supplying wood chips to Northern Pulp. In February, it announced it was closing down because this government failed to provide clear-cut regulations. My question to the minister is this. How many other companies does the minister and his government plan to force out of business before coming up with a real answer?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under previous governments, all we got was clear cut. 96% of our woodlands was being clear cut. That's unacceptable. Nova Scotians have told us so. It's not right. So So, Mr. Speaker, we have a plan, we have an initiative. It's called our Natural Resources Strategy 2011-2020, and it's a way to get away from clear cutting and get onto a more sustainable forestry in this province.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, last week Nova Scotians learned of changes to the ACT program at the IWK, changes structured to reduce wait times for those needing evaluation by reducing treatment programs for children and adolescents. Seems like these aren't the only changes, Mr. Speaker. Capital Health is discontinuing its COMPASS program for adults on July 1st, 2012. So come this date, there will be no inpatient structured treatment for adults with addictions within Capital District. My question to the Minister of Health and Wellness, why are Nova Scotians seeing such drastic changes to mental health and addiction programs when we have yet to see a province-wide mental health and addiction strategy?
Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, mental health services are extremely important services to people in our province. And for too long, too many people have suffered because they have not been able to get access to the services because services were focused more on inpatient than day programs. We are changing the model of service delivery to ensure that more people will be seen earlier, both children, adolescents, and adults, so they get the treatment they need at an earlier opportunity. The results tend to be much better. It's a better use of our healthcare dollars, and we will see a much stronger mental health system as a result of these changes, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Speaker, like last week, we see changes happening in programs in order to put additional resources in other areas without any evidence showing that the programs being sacrificed do not play a valuable role in the continuum of supports in the first place. Instead of providing additional resources on the community end for treatment, we find the financial resources for investment by dismantling other services. And Mr. Speaker, the Minister knows full well this is wrong. How does the Minister intend to deal with increased wait lists for adults deemed by other healthcare professionals as requiring more structured treatment for addictions when all of our provincial capacity is disappearing down to one program in Middleton?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable member and I will have an opportunity to get into the details of new expenditures in the budget. Mr. Speaker, there are an additional approximately $4 million of new investment in our budget for mental health and addiction services. The mental health and addiction strategy is expected later on this spring, Mr. Speaker, and we will see targeted intervention to improve a variety of mental health and addiction services across our province as a result of this work, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, when the COMPASS program in Capital District closes, it will leave one residential structured treatment program in the province, as I said earlier, the 21-day program in Middleton. With the closure of Talbot House, which offered residential treatment of even longer duration than COMPASS, we are rapidly losing capacity.
Order, please. Order. The time has run out for oral questions put by members to ministers. I will now call upon the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call a reply to the budget speech, please?
Reply to the budget speech. Before we do that, I'd like to call upon the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just very briefly, I would like to welcome to the House of Assembly today Mr. Todd Graham, who is the operator of Mackenzie College and a prominent member of the Sydney business community, and I encourage you, sir, and all members to welcome Mr. Graham to the House of Assembly in our proceedings today.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Robocaller.
On Thursday, I had an opportunity to begin my comments on the budget, and I'd like to continue again today to just recap where we were at in terms of this budget and how it's going to affect Nova Scotians. Principally, Mr. Speaker, we said this is a very disappointing budget. I'd like to begin with the fact that the minister himself called this, it's a steady budget. He said, if there's one word that can define it, it's steady. So the NDP feel it's steady as she goes. But I can tell you that the people of Nova Scotia don't feel that things are very steady in their financial lives. The people are feeling the effects of the higher HST, which has been on them for well over a year now. It's pushing up the price of virtually everything that we buy. And our power rates have gone through the roof. They've risen precipitously. It's hurting business and it's hurting our individuals. The costs on individuals have gone up just this year alone under the URB by 9.1%, but that doesn't begin to count the increase that goes along with having demand-side management, which has been a way that the government has spun off other costs that used to be conserved Nova Scotia and put them onto the ratepayers of Nova Scotia by adding this new fee that only ratepayers will pay. And that's hurting everybody. That's a $40 million cost to Nova Scotians, which has been taken out of the budget of the Energy Department and put onto the backs of ratepayers in Nova Scotia. You know, that's the way the government is curbing their costs. That's the way the government is downsizing or showing restraint. But in fact, it's still on the backs of Nova Scotians. It's still a cost that Nova Scotians have to bear. This is the kind of smoke and mirrors that we're seeing in this budget. You know, honestly, a pretend budget that says there's all kinds of restraint when in fact what we see is a lack of accountability, really, essentially a lack of accountability, a way to just change people into another department, take the long-term care administrators and put them into the DHAs. All of a sudden, the Department of Health has cut staff, apparently. Same thing goes with the Conserve Nova Scotia people, you know, and others. So there are a lot of examples like that. Soon we're going to see the Department of Agriculture unload a whole bunch of people from the Agriculture College. And it doesn't mean there's been any restraint. It means that they've just spun them off into another entity. And I think that that's something that people have to realize as we go through this, that life is a lot harder for Nova Scotians under this government. We talked about gasoline prices going up, and they've risen something like 38 cents since 2009 when the government came into its current mandate. And that's a huge increase, Mr. Speaker. It's the largest that it has ever been. You know, I'm glad to see the members on the other side of the House, Mr. Speaker, are listening. I think that's important because I think they have to ask themselves how they're going to answer to their own constituents who are having these problems. Well, I frankly can tell you my own power bill's gone up tremendously, and I know if I've seen it, so have my constituents, so have other people. I'm sure all of you have seen it too, and it does hurt people in the pocketbook. It's interesting to note when you look at just our economic facts here in this province that our consumer price increase last year was the highest in Canada at 3.8%. It was largely driven by heating fuel, which went up 25%. And because so many Nova Scotians heat their homes with heating fuel, in fact, 60% of Nova Scotians, that's the reason why we had much higher increase than other provinces. The heating fuel went up in their provinces too, but they only have a small number of people that heat their homes that way. And so that reliance on heating our homes with that kind of heating fuel has pushed our consumer price index to the highest in Canada. So what's happened with our earnings at the same time, Mr. Speaker? Well, we have the second lowest weekly earnings in the country next to PEI. We have our weekly earnings are $765 a week, whereas Canada's average is $873 a week, more than $100 more on an average per person, per worker. You know, combined with the highest cost of living increases, we're seeing some real problems on the ground with individuals in this province. And nobody can deny that. These figures come from Stats Canada. They come from organizations like the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council and so on. The Atlantic APEC, the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council, said that there was virtually no job growth in Nova Scotia in 2011. Halifax saw growth in jobs, but that was more than made up by a loss of jobs in rural Nova Scotia and in Cape Breton. And so those are very sad things. We have a predominance of members representing rural Nova Scotia and Cape Breton here in this entire House. We do. There's many members representing those ridings. And I think it should be of grave concern that that's happening at a time when all of this is going up. Exactly. Now, our power rates have been rising far faster than other places, and I realize it's because there is a dependence on coal and oil, but we've seen from 2002 to 2010 a 36% increase. And at the very same time, over $1 billion between 2002 and 2010, more than $1 billion was transferred to Emera, Nova Scotia Power's parent company. That's a huge amount of money, Mr. Speaker, going out to another entity that's buying up power companies in the States and the Caribbean and who knows where. That's coming from the ratepayers of Nova Scotia. And I think that's very important in the context of this budget. So we'd like to know what measures the government will plan to do something about the affordability for Nova Scotians, for people who are really trying to make ends meet in this province. I've talked about the price of gasoline going up tremendously, and that hurts not only commuters and people, working, but also businesses that have to import or move their product around. Any kind of transportation has gone up, and that means our food prices are also feeling it, and that's something that, again, is affecting the consumer price index, which, again, was the highest increase in Canada here in Nova Scotia. So despite the amount of advertising that the government's doing to try and create a sense of buoyancy, the fact is people see their bills coming in every month, and they know that costs are getting higher and more difficult to manage. And that's in the face of large loans and forgivable loans to all manner of companies, and we'll get into the IEF, which is now called Jobs Here, and we'll just see. I mean, Jobs Here, a great title, and I said, APEC says there was virtually no job growth in Nova Scotia in 2011. So it doesn't matter how many times you run ads about the great jobs, they're not here, and you're really misleading people who come home, and they're not materialized yet. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know there's some good news around the corner with the SHIP contract, and I hope that it will materialize to the full extent that is being projected and sometimes being exaggerated. I do hope that it will become a reality. But what I'm trying to tell you is the reality of today. And today, Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of pressures on people from one end of this province to the other, and many sectors are feeling it. A lot of people that we've spoken to in small business have said that they would like to sell their businesses. They're not making money. It's too difficult. They've talked about the lack of disposable income. I'm thinking particularly of a roundtable we held not long ago in my riding, where businesses were saying that there's less disposable income. And so if you're having a restaurant or a retail operation, they're just not seeing the sales that they did in the past. And at the very same time, they're seeing enormous electricity charges and high costs of operating their business. There have been increases in the minimum wage, which I know helps workers, but to go back to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, they said clearly they would prefer the government to change the basic personal exemption for workers in Nova Scotia. That would mean that government would make the hit so that more people would have more money in their pockets. That's the best measure to help people, and it doesn't hurt business. It would allow the government to leave more money in the pockets of individuals. They therefore have more money to spend, and they can take that money and use it in many ways that would spin through the economy. That's what the government talks about, the ripple effects. It's a very good idea. Thank you. I think there are so many things that business has pointed out and that the government has not done. Their claim to fame here of taking off the corporations tax, I think it was the capital tax, is something that was actually a commitment made by the Conservative government before the NDP came to power. I think it was in the 06-07 budget. And I am glad to see that that's been followed through on. And the slow decrease of 0.5 percentage point a year, it was, I think we had a 5% tax on small business, and it's now down to 3.5%. That's a steady continuation on lowering the small business tax for any income over $400,000. Mr. Speaker, that was something, again, that's been talked about and committed to by previous governments. So again, it's good to follow through on those commitments and not to create a state of cynicism. But don't take all the credit for it, because it's something that was begun in advance of this government. Really, I think the key thing for us is the cost of living and the affordability, which is so difficult in Nova Scotia today. And at the same time as people are struggling with their own services and high taxes and the additional HST, which the government chose to put on, we're seeing services cut to Nova Scotians. And that is especially evident in health and education services. Mr. Speaker, we heard today during question period some very hard-hitting questions around the cost of education and around the difficulty that school boards are having in adjusting to less funds to run their schools. They are under tremendous pressure to offer a quality education with less money. And the direct correlation between the number of students and the spending just doesn't hold water, Mr. Speaker. We started in 2003 with the lowest per student spending in the country. And as we increased spending, the results got better. And to turn around now and start to slash education is the wrong way to go. Absolutely. It's regressive. And at a time when you're in any kind of economic turmoil, your best way out is through an educated population. Right. Mr. Speaker, today I read in an article that we have 25% of our adults, people over 20, who don't have a high school education. Clearly, we need to invest in education to make sure that more young people graduate and more of them are able to take the jobs that are coming in the future. And the government has shown some investment in a trade center at Cole Harbour High School, and that is important, certainly, that we get ready for the trades that are coming. But we have to take people who are in the workforce now who are not capable of accessing those jobs that are going to come. And we need to do some retraining at that level as well, because that really is a dreadful way to have it, that 25% of your population don't have a high school education. And it's not going to get better if you cut librarians and if you cut services out of our schools. And frankly, the librarians, I think, have a very direct relationship to literacy and to graduation. They have a lot to do in the schools. They play an important role, and they may be seen as expendable, but that is not the case in reality. They are needed in every school, and we need them to be well qualified as well. That's a direct link to literacy. And literacy appears nowhere in the throne speech this time round. It's not even mentioned as a priority for this government. And I think we know where the priority of this government is. It's certainly not with the parents. It's not with children. It's not with health care and health care workers. In fact, a lot of the cuts that are coming are hitting those two sectors, and I think it's worth noting that many of the employees that are being impacted are women. And we saw that when the member from Bedford Birch Cove recently had shown the figures showing that women and the disparity between women and men's income is higher in Nova Scotia than it is in Canada, where it's actually been reversing. Ours is going the opposite direction, and that's not a good signal for the many families that depend on on two incomes or on the mother's income, definitely. So we have to see a change in that. Madam Speaker, I wanted to point out again about some of the estimates that I think were not very clearly tied to reality, perhaps one could say. I mentioned in my opening the other day that the budget over the last number of years under the NDP government has had the revenues depressed and the expenses overstated. By so doing, you can easily control your spending because you've estimated a lot more spending than is actually, likely to occur. You've taken a worst-case scenario, and the same on the revenue. You put sort of the worst-case scenario assumptions in place, and your revenue is going to be depressed. If anything better comes along, your revenue looks a lot better, and you've got reasons at those quarterly updates to give rosy news to the people of Nova Scotia. And I know the finance minister enjoys that each time, that he can come back and say that he's under budget again. under budget, still neglecting to sort of point out that it's still millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in deficit. Nevertheless, running a tight ship if you listen to the finance minister. I mentioned the other day as well that the finance department spending is up 30% and just since 2009. You know, for a finance minister who's talking about restraint and control, it does really raise some questions. I think it might make some people even more cynical than they are now. And I hope when we get to estimates, we can really review what's been going on at the Department of Finance. But on the surface, we see about 85 more people working there than previously, and the budget up significantly, 30%, as I say, in that one department alone. So I think that is very important to look at. Now, one of the estimates that I think is important for everybody to look at is the estimate on what will the price of gasoline average out at in the coming year. And we all know that right now it's over $1.45 here in Halifax. It went up again on Thursday, and that's really, you know, almost a historic high, I would say. I can't remember it being that high in the past, and we expect it to rise more into the summer months when the demand is highest. So, Madam Speaker, what would you expect that the average might be for the coming year? And again, take into account that last year's average was $1.30. Today, the price is $1.45 in Metro. And we estimate in this budget, if you can believe it, that gasoline prices in the coming year will be $1.23 on average. And that, to me, just seems completely you know, ridiculous. It just does. But if you use the price of gasoline as a way to calculate your motor fuel tax or your HST that you're going to take in, then that will help to depress your revenue. It's one of the measures that we look at in the revenue side of this budget. And again, I just think it doesn't have any bearing in reality, Madam Speaker. And I think what's clear to say, I've talked about the difficulty that Nova Scotians are having with their own bills and with keeping, just affording life in Nova Scotia. And what's important is that when they pay high taxes, they certainly expect to have quality programs in place. And that's why I'm so concerned about the cuts to education and the cuts that we'll be seeing in health care as well. Really, we've been given less for what we're paying than we had previously. And under the NDP government, it has in fact been much less. And I think there's no two ways about that. Madam Speaker, I wanted to talk a little bit about the budget there for economic and rural development and tourism.